questions and you want answers. Welcome to the Q&A show.
Thanks for joining us again this evening. It's the Q&A show, as the announcement just made, and it's Tuesday night. So this is the 30th of April. So tomorrow will come the 1st of June. May, just a checking. Dr Grady is with us again still this evening and will be also on Thursday night. I'd like to welcome him. Good evening, sir.
Good evening indeed.
We had so many emails last night and texts that we're going to carry on with those just to start with, because I feel that's the fairest way I can be to our viewers that are very keen on writing in, and we want to get on with that. So if you want to take part in tonight's program as well, if you're watching for the first time, welcome. Revelation TV's very pleased to have you in such a program as this, where you can ask Bible questions or biblically based questions, and also anything to do with the origins of the universe, the earth. How old is the earth? How long has mankind been on the earth, and was the flood real, and all those other things that people would just call fairy stories for adults. But really, there's a good reason why Jesus mentioned them, and he was no liar, was he? If he talked about Adam and Eve and the flood, etc., and he didn't talk about them in allegorical ways, as actual fact. So, and lessons to be learned from them, even Sodom and Gomorrah. So get those into us live at revelationtv.com, and the text numbers on your screen. A text that came in yesterday was asking Dr Grady, how come Adam and Eve and the rest of the patriarchs weren't warned about the eternal punishment of hell, as how Jesus taught about it when he was on the earth. So we were trying to find out, when was the first time that hell, or the derivative Sheol of that expression hell, came from, and when was it first used in the Bible?
Well, of course, as I'd mentioned, in terms of punishment for not following God's commandment, it goes right back to the Garden of Eden. God said, if you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, dying thou shalt die. So that's, of course, talking about death, which is also mentioned in Romans, etc. But in terms of the use of the word, in terms of Sheol, which means grave technically, but is always used euphemistically for death or hell and Hades and so on, although hell would be the correct word, since Hades really came along later with Gehenna, which is really a Greek word. But the first reference we could find about Sheol is actually after the flood itself. And we found that in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 22. And that's the first time in the Hebrew the word Sheol is used, at least in the books of the Bible as we order them in the English Bible.
So that's Deuteronomy?
Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 22.
Okay.
And in the English Bibles, it is generally translated either as simply in the Hebrew as Sheol, or sometimes, for instance, in the King James, it is used for hell.
Or the pit. Don't leave me in Sheol, the pit.
Well, again, Sheol, it can be used for pit or grave or hell, but it's euphemistic when it's used for hell. But grave, death, pit, hell, these are the words that are usually translated.
Okay. Is it possible Satan had direct influence on Darwin to found the evolution theory, and thereby undermine God or make people lose faith in the Bible? Since he came out with the theory, more people started to deny the authenticity of the Bible. And this is from Alex.
Well, Alex, there's no question about a satanic, demonic association here, not directly with Darwin, I don't mean that, but in the sense that he in his own writings understood that what he was theorizing had a definite undermining of Christianity. He did write in those terms. And although he preferred to be called an agnostic, he himself said that he really sided with the atheists. It's just that in the 1800s, the word atheist was too strong for him. In polite English gentleman language, he preferred to use agnostic, which had been coined by Sir Thomas Huxley, or Dr. Thomas Huxley. However, remember that evolution goes back much, much farther than that, and evolutionary philosophy can be traced back to the garden and does start with Satan. There's no question about that. But Darwin did realize that in his theories he was undermining Christianity, and he did write about it.
Rose asks, could you please ask Dr. Grady what he thinks about the planet Nibiru? And can he explain how it's showing up on photographs of the sun? We have read that the planet is supposed to pass the Earth in August and cause havoc to the Earth. We would really appreciate his views on this.
It's mythology.
Okay. Could there be such happening where something out of this universe would come and impact the Earth and cause perhaps the end of the Earth? Because there was one rendition that I was reading where the world would go off in a hissing noise, or like some sort of like burned in a ball of fire. But the other thing...
Well, of course, Howard, I mean, the judgment by fire is mentioned in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 through 7. So,
yeah.
You know, the hissing sound of fire is definitely, if you'll excuse the expression, biblical in that sense. Mm-hmm. And, of course, we have near misses now from asteroids, comets, meteors. We've actually had 2 come into the atmosphere within the last couple of months and break up. I was in Russia the day I landed in Moscow back in February. Of course, there was the big one that came in over the Urals that made so much news, but there was another one recently. I think it was in the Southeast Pacific or Southwest Pacific. I don't recall at the second. But, you know, things are hitting the atmosphere all the time. The thing is, how big are they? How much damage do they do? What angle do they come in at? But the really big ones that we need to be worried about are generally deflected by the gravity of what are called the shepherding planets. That's the 4 great giant gas planets that are beyond the asteroid belt. They're called shepherding planets because they protect us from these things. So are we susceptible to being hit by an asteroid or a comet or a meteor? Yes, we are susceptible. In most cases, however, they cause little damage. Obviously, we've had, like I say, 2 notable ones this year. And if you go back to the early 1900s, there was one much bigger that came in over Siberia, but it made very little press because there was nobody there to see it.
All right. Rose mentions also Luke 21, where she says that also there would be strange things happening in the skies. Well, verse 25 of chapter 21 says there will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on the earth dismay among the nations, in perplexity
Yes.
at the roaring of the sea and the waves, men fainting out of fear, and because of the things that are coming upon the world. And for the powers of the heaven will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and glory.
And as we have mentioned, in the end times, there will be more and more natural disasters. I've talked about this many times, including last night. This is simply the aging of the system. That is, when the system gets older, there's more catastrophes because there's going to be more and more earthquakes. When you have earthquakes, the earth cannot heal itself. And so earthquakes lead to more earthquakes. When you have earthquakes, this leads to volcanic activity. Not every time, but it's the trigger for volcanic activity. And so we're going to have more and more earthquakes. We're going to have more and more volcanoes. And remember that volcanoes can do things such as when they put out enough ash and other volatiles, you'll have, for instance, a red sun, red sunsets, red sunrises, but could even cause the moon to appear blood red simply because of the light filtering through a large volcanic eruption. But these are natural disasters prophesied ahead of time as a natural process of the aging of the system.
I'm glad you finished with that, because that was going to be my next question. Prophesied by whom, though?
But prophesied by God, obviously, through his prophets.
Yep.
Definitely in the Bible.
Yep.
Definitely spoken of that will occur at the end times. But these are natural events God foreknew that the aging of the system would lead to. And so there will be more of this kind of thing. We can expect it. It's what I'll call natural, but it's supernaturally prophesied accurately, but it is a natural process of the aging of all the systems, not just on the Earth, but in the moon, in the comets, and the meteorites, etc.
Okay, moving on. Harry says, in the past I've heard Dr. Grady describe humans as triune beings, body, soul, and spirit, with the mind or consciousness being part of the soul. If that is so, how do we relate to the spirit? In other words, how do we become aware of our spiritual being if we're not conscious of it?
Well, indeed, we are 3-part beings. We reflect the triune nature of the God who created us, who is body, soul, and spirit. And the problem is that while the spirit is the real you, your soul is your intellect, emotion, and will. And so you have to understand that in terms of perception in the natural realm, we do this through the soul, through the intellect, through the emotions, through the will. We cannot actually perceive our own spirit, but we do know that God tells us that it is there, that it is the real essence of us, and that because our soul and spirit are united, we will go on into an eternity future. However, where you will spend that eternity future is based upon decisions you make in this lifetime.
And they will echo into eternity. In evolution theory, there is disagreement amongst experts on some key points. In creation, with that theory, there are people like yourself, Ken Ham, Jonathan Safati, etc. Are they all in agreement or on things, or do they disagree on some key points?
Well, remember that there are people who believe that God used evolution to create, and are Christians. They're called theistic evolutionists. Then there are the young earth creationists like Safarti and myself. And yet understand that since we were not there, we were not eyewitnesses to the actual creation event, or we were not eyewitnesses to the flood of Noah, that there are young earth creation scientists, and I would say, for instance, Walter Brown, obviously Ken Ham, Safarti, myself. We could bring in others, but the point is, regardless, there are major young earth creation scientists, and we will differ, for instance, on the mechanism that caused the flood. But we do not differ on the age of the earth. We do not differ on many aspects. But because we were not there, we were not eyewitnesses, we each model what happened differently. And so it's not so much difference of agreement as much as it is that there are just different theories, different ideas about how this happened or how that happened, because we were not eyewitnesses.
Mm-hmm. But there's a general agreement, isn't there?
There's absolutely
those people?
A general agreement.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of young earth creationists, we all agree on a young earth. Mm-hmm. We all agree on geochronometers. We all agree on the scriptures that are being supported by geochronometers. We all agree on the worldwide flood. We might disagree on the mechanism that caused it to happen, but that's just a disagreement. It's not a conflict that separates us.
And they all believe in sin and death following Adam. Absolutely.
All sin, death, you know, salvation through Christ, the blood of the cross, the crucifixion, resurrection. I mean, we all agree on those aspects.
What about the genealogies, according to the Bible?
Well, again, we agree on genealogies, although, again, there are some who would say, well, there's one extra name. But, again, it's kind of irrelevant to the age of the earth issue. And we also know why that one name was there. It came from the Septuagint, which was brought in by Luke. So we know why it's there. But in terms of the genealogies going back 6,000 years, you would find basically a universal acceptance among young earth creationists. But old earth people who are theistic evolutionists would disagree.
Mm-hmm. Last night,
but that does not keep them from going to heaven. It's just that we disagree on those things as to how God created. Did he create it whole, perfect, complete 6,000 years ago? Or did it do it slowly and gradually over a long period of time through an evolutionary process? Now, I say that that's inconsistent with the scriptures, but it doesn't keep you from going to heaven.
And inconsistent also with quite a lot of evidence.
Oh, it's inconsistent with the geochronometers. It's inconsistent with the physical evidence. You know, the fossil record is much better understood as the result of a worldwide flood than slow and gradual accumulation. And the more we know about what's in the ground, the more we know it disagrees with an evolutionary concept.
Martin writes in, and this was following what we were talking about last night. We did talk a little bit about the monetary system and possible introduction of one world monetary money and system, and also the fact that the world is suffering tremendously and man not really knowing what to do, and the way out to sort of stabilize the world economies. Martin says quantitative easing, the policies adopted by diverse countries since 2008, is effectively printing more money, which in turn, aka the Weimar Republic, leads to inflation. However, inflation is on the decrease, not increase, and commodity prices, including gold and oil, are decreasing. The stock market demonstrates the only upward market, with companies like Amazon selling at over 165 times earnings. The markets appear to be increasingly a manipulated environment. Does Dr. Grady agree?
Well, I'm not going to get into conspiracy theories. Please understand that. But there's only one reason why the stock market is going up, and that's because of the extremely socialistic, communistic, negative economic policies of various countries in Europe and unfortunately here in the States today. And what is happening is, since interest rates are so low, the only place that people can speculatively begin to try to get a genuine earnings on their money is to go into the stock market. And so it's artificially causing the stock market to go up because there's simply no other place to go.
All right, okay. Just looking at, I'm just going to try and look up a scripture here, but let me go to this email first. Ray asks, what does Dr. Grady think of all the talk about the red moons?
Well, again, we've talked about this on previous programs, and I think it is an error to talk about these red moons other than to simply say red moons do happen. This is because of a eclipse of the moon by the Earth, but people who try to say ahead of time what is exactly going to happen based on simply a natural event, where they cannot be correct necessarily, because these red moons depend on the exact distances that are involved, and frankly, they're just not going to be able to accurately prophesy these in their own minds because they're human.
This is also a money question. Why should we be paying into the UK and the EU tax system when the elite use, putting this politely, wealth management protection, rule for one and rule for others? I've decided to join the elite and pay the minimum amount into taxation, as I believe my money is wasted by the UK government and its various departments. Handing over our money for anti-God government should not be encouraged. Ooh, I don't know about that, sir. Anyway, the more we give, the more it encourages them. Laughing out loud, says Mark. Interesting that this week, just gone, there was a talk about the government actually, it invites 4 of the top accountancy firms to come up with some anti-tax schemes, really. Sorry, it comes up with some sort of taxation policies that they can introduce for the government to be able to tax the people more effectively. That's what then they go away, use that inside information to warn their clients, obviously selling their services, how to counter that which they've actually made available to the government. So that that's a terrible situation, is it not? And apart from being immoral.
It really is, but you have to remember, what's the driving force here? The driving force is people getting away from biblical principles, biblical financial principles, and governments becoming more and more communistic, socialistic, humanistic, naturalistic, mechanistic, whatever words you want to use. Mm-hmm. That as they are doing this and they're trying to usurp God's position and the government taking the place of God. God's system is that the church should be taking care of welfare. But what has happened is the government is replacing God. And when government does that, God is much more efficient than the government. The government is very inefficient. It builds a bureaucracy. In its inefficiency, it then builds greed and corruption. And it has this insatiable thirst for more and more money. Well, that becomes confiscatory. And so the confiscatory taxes, in essence, get to the point where, if you'll take a look, for instance, at the writings of Gibbon, when he looked at what caused the Roman Empire to fall, well, it wasn't just taxation, but one of the major reasons that Rome fell was the entire system became based in welfare. Taxes became so high that they could not be supported, and the economy simply collapsed. Now, that was not the only reason. There was also the loss of morality, because Rome started, as all nations do in the cycle of nations, with a very strong moralistic view. They had a very strong view of their own destiny. But over hundreds of years, what happened? Well, they developed a welfare system. The Roman Republic found out, the Roman senators found out that they could buy votes through the welfare system. And so they developed one, they expanded it, they got it bigger and bigger because just like all the other socialistic, communistic systems, you know, vote for me, I'll give you 10% more next year out of the federal tax monies. And so the thing just continues to balloon and finally becomes unsupportable.
Let me say to Mark that really we have to pay taxes. We're obligated to pay unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Even though it's irksome because you see the corruption, you see the wasting of money, but it's still our obligation. And we wouldn't have the police to protect us if we didn't pay our taxes. Let me just put it as simple as that, because the day will come where we will need the police to protect us.
We need government. Government has a vital role. And regardless of any place you look in the Bible, you'll find that government, starting with Genesis chapter 9, human government is essential. But again, the purposes of it were to have a standing army for protection of borders, build roads, and so forth. But the government was never to be in the welfare system.
I remember trying to remember the exact stat, but it's, even if I'm not quite correct, it gives you a rough idea. The difference between the time where we had the British Empire, where the sun never set, there was something like 45,000 civil servants in the Great Britain at that time, running that whole empire. And today we only have very little, you know, sort of at the moment, England, Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, soon perhaps to only be England and Northern Ireland, who knows. But we have, is it 700,000? Something like that in working for the government?
Yes, and if I can make a little further comment about this sort of thing. Number one, Howard and I would tell you, you have to pay the taxes, be lawful, don't cheat, etc. That's a bad witness for a Christian just to start with. However, what you do need to do is be involved in the election of righteous politicians, at least as best you can. Always pick the less of the two evils type of thing. And try to get these entitlement programs off the books, go back to the way government should have been in the first place. And so it's in the political process that you fight this. It's not in trying to cheat on taxes or whatever like that. It's in getting involved in the politics, getting involved with supporting righteous, biblically based government as best you can.
Here's an email from Ed, and I think possibly this Ed, if it's the one, might be the one who's not a Christian, not a believer, but does watch the programs. And this is a good set of questions here. He says, is the purpose of our lives on earth to, 1, find God and serve him, 2, learn to think, act and be like Jesus, 3, to bring others to God and spread the Bible teachings, or perhaps all 3, or none of the above, says Ed?
Well, I think that those 3 are a very good list. However, I would put different words and so forth to that. Our purpose is to have fellowship with God. Our purpose is to be voluntarily worshiping him for who he is and not what he does for us. After that comes the rest of it, which is, of course, wanting others to share, so that's called evangelism, wanting others to share and receive the gift of grace, receive the gift of salvation, and to be with him in the eternity future. So, you know, while we might put it in different words, that's not a bad little list. It's just not worded the way I would word it.
Yeah. Seek God while he may be found, comes to mind. And also he who finds God or perceives his will and goes ahead to try and fulfill that as best he can or she can. And yes, to be a footstep follower of Jesus Christ means to be a Christian, I believe. And to bring others to God and spread the Bible teachings is Jesus' last words in Matthew 28, where it says, go thee therefore into all the world.
And make disciples.
Yeah, exactly.
And make converts and make disciples.
Yeah,
and today is the day of salvation.
Yeah. Excellent. And from Ed, coming from Ed, that's very good. I wish a lot of Christians would actually think about that.
It's a good list.
Yeah.
You know, like I said, I might word it differently, but it was a good list.
Let me see. Dear Grady, do you think the 3 soon-to-erupt volcanoes will cover the entire northern hemisphere with acid rain? Please don't give up, Howard. Best wishes, Sally from the Isle of Wight. This is in connection with the Icelandic volcanoes.
Well, first of all, volcanoes put out sulfur dioxide, and sulfur dioxide is the basis for acid rain. So whenever you have volcanic activity, It's going to lead eventually to some amount, in some cases a lot, some cases less, depends on the eruption. However, I don't predict eruptions and I don't predict the consequences of them other than the generalities of what we know. The Icelandic volcanoes have caused a tremendous amount of grief to the UK. Obviously, just a couple of years ago, we all remember that very well. But if you go back to the 1700s, there was a much larger one which killed a very large quantity of people in the UK, made others very sick for a long time, caused crop failures. So Icelandic volcanoes are a bit of a disaster to the UK when they happen.
Yeah. Just worth mentioning, and I'm looking at, I can't believe how time is flying, and so many more emails coming even tonight, and let alone yesterday, to catch up with these. But what about happened just a few hundred years ago? I think we forget this because it's not taught heavily in history. What happened when the volcanoes actually covered the sun? How long were we in this dark period? Was it nearly 2 years that covered up most of Europe?
Okay, well, let's talk about all these various times. If you go back to the 1700s, you have Laki, that was in Iceland. That caused you to have some very serious problems, a lot of deaths, crop failures in England. If we go back to 1600, there was an eruption in Peru. This caused 1 million people to die in Siberia. We can go back to, for instance, 1815, when Tambora erupted.
That's
in
the
1816, it caused the year without summer in Europe, when it snowed in all 12
year
months
without summer, yeah.
Yeah, the year without summer, that's 1816.
England's been suffering from that forever.
Is when
Sorry.
And remember that this is a volcano that's in Indonesia. So when Tambora erupted, it put 80 cubic kilometers, that's 20 cubic miles of volcanic ash and other ejecta, aerosols and so forth, into the air, causing the year without summer the very next year.
Wow.
We saw in 1991, you mentioned of acid rain. In 1991, Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines, which is near the equator, put an estimated 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the air, and all of that would become acid rain at some point.
God making Adam from dust or dirt in the ground and making Eve from Adam's rib. Is there any scientific basis or arguments you can use to support this, as often it's the thing skeptics say is the most ridiculous account in Genesis? And this is from Ashtanga.
Well, forgive me for promoting something here, but we have a DVD called The Creationist View of Marriage that's available on our websites. And it was produced through Revelation TV. And it's an hour-and-a-half teaching on this. So first of all, the word rib there does not mean a single individual bony rib in a man's rib cage. It really means that which gives support. And God took all the material to make the body of the woman out from inside the body of the man. However, when it says that man was made from dust in Genesis 2:7, it's true, because all of the atoms in our body are common in the dust of the earth, and God hand-assembled the body of the man with enough material for two bodies, Eve's material inside, and was removed at the time that God removed that which gives support from the body of the man to make the body of the woman. Now, that's the Bible side of it. In terms of a scientific side, I can say yes, there is a genetic thing, because remember that in the gender chromosomes, women have two X-shaped chromosomes. During their lifetime, one of them is deactivated, and their gender is determined by the one X chromosome. Men have one X and one Y. Now, for men, the Y chromosome deactivates the X chromosome, and we are then men. The thing is that, of course, because of what we see genetically, we can then definitely prove that when God created Adam and Eve and he removed the material to make Eve, he removed only that material, those living cells, which had two X's. And this is why when men and women co-join and produce children, the man produces one X and one Y that matches with an X or an X in the woman. And that's why the boys and girls are roughly 50%. So yeah, there's also some genetic evidence as well.
Now, this question, Lindy would have actually heard, because it's catching up for tonight's program, these emails coming in tonight. So don't need to go into too great detail, but because it's headed question from a new Christian, I just want you to quickly go over this point again. Let me read. Thank you for Revelation TV, your wonderful programs and teaching. Can you explain what is the difference between the soul and the spirit? Are we made up of three parts, one flesh, one body, and spirit and soul? Does our spirit and soul go to heaven if we are believers? Asks Lindy.
Yes. Okay. We talked about how in Genesis 2:7, God made the body of the man from previously existing material, from the dust of the earth, from the atoms that he had spoken into existence, breathes into him the nephesh, which is the breath of life, but is translated from nephesh in Hebrew into body, into life, soul, or blood, and that soul is intellect, emotion, will. And then God took the spirit he had prepared for Adam and placed it inside the body. He became a three-part triune being. This is even more clear when we go to Ecclesiastes. If you go to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and I'm just going to suggest we go there for a moment. Don't want to make this into a real long Bible study or anything. But when we go into Ecclesiastes...
What chapter?
Chapter 3 is where I want to start.
Yep. What verse? Or from the beginning?
Well, no. No. But in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, in starting with, it starts off with there's a time for this, time for that.
Mm-hmm.
When you go to verse 19.
19, 20, yeah.
Well, I want to go to 19.
Okay.
For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts, meaning those animals that live on the dry land, is the same. As one dies, the other indeed. They all have the same breath. Now that's soul. What it's referring to here is the animals that live on dry land, cats, dogs, dinosaurs, and people. Because cats, dogs, cows, horses, they have a soul. They have intellect, emotion, and will. But they don't have a spirit. They are only two-part beings, not three-part beings. And notice what it says there, and there is no advantage for man or beast, all is vanity, meaning we all die biologically. Verse 20, all go the same place, meaning when we're buried, we go into the ground. All came from the dust, and all return to dust. We're all made from the atoms that God spoke into existence. Verse 21, who knows that the breath or spirit of man ascends upward, and the breath or soul of the beast ascends downward to the earth? What happens when a cat, dog, dinosaur dies? Their body dies biologically, goes into the ground. Their soul, their intellect, emotion, and will also goes into the ground, and they cease to exist because they do not have an eternal spirit. It's clear when we go to chapter 12, because in chapter 12...
Well, that's it, verse 7.
Specifically verse 7. The dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it.
Very clear, very clear.
Now, what happens is, because we are human, because we are triune, because we are body, soul, and spirit, our body dies biologically, same fate as animals. But because our soul and our spirit are united, we will go on into an eternity future. It will return to the God, the Creator. However, if you're not a believer, when you return to Him, you will be sent to hell. If you are a Christian, you will then join Him eternally in heaven. So the question becomes, where will you spend eternity? But you are a triune being, body, soul, and spirit. We are the only creature made in the image of God. This is the only place in the entire universe where creatures are made in the image of God. We are triune as He is triune, reflecting His created nature, His creative nature. And when we die, we will go on into an eternity future, the question being where.
Mm-hmm. That was a very good
Ecclesiastes 12
answer
really
for
helps
Lindy.
understand that.
Yeah, Lindy, I hope you really got that. That's really great. And also, it's going to create some problems for people who have pets and think that they're going to heaven as well.
I know, and believe me,
Yeah.
I know. And I regret that, I really do. And I had a dog when I was growing up, tremendously important in my life. I won't see him again. Mm-hmm. But there will be creatures in heaven. They just won't be the resurrected pets. And I know that when people hear that, they're going to give me a lot of grief, and they're going to think badly of me. But believe me, in the most loving way. Mm-hmm. I'm simply teaching the Bible correctly. I am not going to gloss over something which the Bible is very clear about.
Well, our lovely Peter from the BBC would actually say he would have a problem with what you said last night with regards to Luke. He said, I'm somewhat taken aback by Brother Grady's statement last night that Luke was a Jew from Egypt. Could you please ask him what source he uses to come to such a confident conclusion? I ask because I've read that a number of sources, including Eusebius of Caesarea and Jerome, claim that Luke came from Antioch in Syria. Also, some Bible students say the Apostle Paul makes a distinction between those of the circumcision, therefore Jews, and other non-Jews in Colossians 4, verses 10 to 13. Others, Mark and Justus, Jesus, were of the circumcision, and Luke and Ephraim were among his other companions, therefore inferring Luke was a Gentile.
And I would, of course, defer, for instance, to Eusebius, who is the great church historian 200 years after the events occurred, who would still have much of this history available to him, and we know that he had many writings available to him that we don't even have available today, and would not if he himself had not copied them. But I think that when we take a look at church history, that there's much more substance to Luke having come from Alexandria.
What papyrus or account would you rely on for backing that up?
Well,
apart from
somebody said that having read many sources,
of Eusebius,
having read many sources, and from what we can see in the Bible, I don't have the detail to kind of give to you right at this moment, and it's not something I'm going to be dogmatic about. You and I were not there; we didn't see his birth certificate. Well,
it's interesting to have another thought, particularly like this, because it seems strange that Luke was around, and he, being a doctor, he was, as it's alleged to be, was very interested in recording all the miracles and the healings that Jesus and his apostles did. So
well, and I teach more often from the Gospel of John when I teach from the Gospels, but Luke is my favorite apostle. And the reason for that is because of how he writes as a doctor, and he uses this word, I'm writing to you, Theophilus, friend of God, so that you would know about these events. He writes his gospel. But we know he wasn't there. He was not one of the originals, yet he does write a gospel, much as Paul wrote. For instance, when he talks about the Last Supper, he writes as if he was there, but we know he wasn't. So it's by revelation of the Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. But Luke was not one of the original 12, nor 13.
Okay, moving on. He has saved us and called us to a holy life. This is looking at 2 Timothy 1 verse 9, under the title of Wrong Belief. Not because of anything we have done, but because of his own purpose and grace. This grace was given in Christ Jesus before the beginning of time. Dear Grady, you are completely misguided when you say your salvation is up to you. It's not your choice. God has already chosen his elect in Christ from before the earth's foundation were laid, and your salvation is not dependent on your behavior. You're an incorrigible heretic, says David Maples.
Oh, thank you, David.
That's very encouraging. I think you're taking it out of context. I mean, you just simply said the choice is up to you because we were talking about it over a long period of time, this issue of salvation, that in the end, because it might have been in answer to what is the unforgivable sin, I think that's probably where it came up last night. So how would you answer, David, anyway?
Well, first of all, David, last night, of course, I did talk about the only unforgivable sin is not receiving your salvation, because there is no other sin which the blood of Christ cannot atone for.
But of course, what he's saying that it was before the foundation of the earth.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's that belief system again? Calvinism.
Well, first of all, let me again say, if what David wrote were correct from what I just heard, then we have hyper-Calvinism. Where God predetermines who will be saved and who won't. We have no free will. We become simply robots, and God is capricious. That if you take David's philosophy, as I heard it, to its logical conclusion, that is not what the Bible says. The Bible says that we have been given 100% free will. Now, God knew ahead of time what our decision would be because He knows all things. He is omniscient. He knows all things, as well as being omnipotent, omnipresent, omnijudicious. But he knows all things. So he knows our decision beforehand. But he doesn't influence it in the sense he doesn't make us do it. We are 100% free will being to receive or reject the gift of salvation ourselves. His foreknowledge is irrelevant to the act of doing it. And of course, the Calvinistic position of, for those he did foreknow, he also did predestine. We have talked about this before, that those that God did foreknow, because he knew ahead of time, he's all-knowing, he did predestine a plan by which that they would be saved, and Jesus is the Lamb of God slain since before the foundation of the world. But we have 100% free will to accept or reject the gift of grace during our lifetime, and it's based on our decision of whether we will or we will not as to where we will spend eternity. God foreknowing what that decision is doesn't influence us in doing it. And if you take the hyper-Calvinistic position, then there would be no evangelism whatsoever.
There'd be no point.
Well, there'd be no point in it because you can't change it.
That is an excellent point, Dr. Grady, because I was just trying to think through both sides of the arguments for Calvinism and just, you know, total free will to accept or not is borne out by what you just said. Say it again.
Well, and I take a balanced position personally between Arminius and Calvin. I know that you're supposed to be one or the other. I don't. I'm in the middle. First of all, if you take Arminianism to its logical conclusion, then if it's, you know, a salvation would be presumptuous, that I could do anything afterwards. Well, that's not biblical. But if you take Calvin and go to hyper-Calvinism, then there's no sense in evangelism, and there's no sense in even suggesting that you could accept salvation because it's already been predetermined. You're just a robot.
In that
and that's
case,
not biblical either.
Yeah, and there'd be no need for Christ to come and give his life for us, really, because
exactly. There'd be
it's already been
sense
predetermined.
In the crucifixion, the resurrection. I mean, it takes all of it out of the picture.
Exactly. Yeah.
But if you go to hyper-Arminianism, then it becomes presumptive faith that allows you to do anything and everything you want, no consequences, because basically everybody gets saved or whatever. You know, I mean, there's problems with hyper-Arminianism as well.
Total grace. Never mind. Anyway, let me get this straight, says Graham. Oops. Humans are smart enough to have devised many very accurate methods for measuring time, from picoseconds to millennia. But when someone adds up all the ages of all the people mentioned in the Bible for the purpose of trying to establish some kind of timeline and fit the Bible stories into a geological time, when these fail to align, then it must be the science that is wrong. Einstein was right. There is no limit to religious stupidity.
Well, forgive me, I'm not familiar with that particular quote from Einstein, although I am familiar with a lot of quotes from him. If he said that, I was just not aware of it. I would point out to you, though, again, Graham, there are near 300 scientific geochronometers proving the Earth, solar system, galaxy, universe are young. We have many articles either on my website or other websites. We have at least 2 DVDs and a CD that we produced, the 2 DVDs with Revelation TV, in depth, talking about, for instance, the decay of the Earth's magnetic field or the decay of the speed of light, many, many others. The recession rate of the moon, the small amount of mud in river deltas. There are so many geochronometers, Graham, that you simply refuse to believe. The genealogies go back 6,000 years, but the Earth cannot be more than 8,000 to 10,000 years old, even without the Bible, simply because of the decay of the Earth's magnetic field. So we, as creationists, look at the science. You are simply accepting the evolutionary philosophy.
Okay, ready with some more emails here because we're into the last 10 minutes, Dr. G. Hi, guys.
Believe it.
We have learned so much from Dr. Grady. We really appreciate you both. Is it true that the Vesuvius volcano is overdue to erupt? And will it be as disastrous as the scientists say? Giorgio?
Well, again, Vesuvius has certainly been a very active volcano. Etna, however, is far more active. Whether Vesuvius will erupt or not, I will not predict eruptions. Nobody can. I don't care how much you know. You cannot predict an eruption. You can say that it appears that an eruption might be imminent based on seismic readings, but you cannot predict them. This is obvious, for instance, at Mount St. Helens in 1980. Yes, it was obvious the eruption was probably imminent. Yes, it looked like so-and-so, but the fact of the matter is nobody could predict the actual date of its occurrence, because nobody could predict the earthquake that actually caused the final eruption to occur. But Vesuvius is certainly has the potential for activity, but Etna is very active at this time.
Vesuvius was the one that destroyed Pompeii, was it?
Pompeii and Herculaneum.
Right.
There were two cities that were devastated.
Right. What scripture says the church is the bride? Which is
was that a question?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, you probably, if you do a search on Google, it'll actually tell you that. But
well, I'm about to say a search
coming for the bride, it would be like
that.
Matthew, would it? It'd be repeated a couple of times in the Gospels, wouldn't it?
Well, and I would also point out other scriptures in addition to that. Matthew 19 alludes to it. I think that we could certainly get many other scriptures for that. Ephesians 5 certainly does allude to it and so forth. But we are told that we are the bride of Christ. That's the saved men and women.
This is pretty much along the same lines of what you just talked about previous time there a minute ago. Christopher writes in, how does there... I'm going to try and read this with the grammar that it should be. How does free will exist if there is a plan? For example, I often hear people say that the Lord decided to call up such and such who died, perhaps in a car crash. Does this mean God made the person who caused the crash to do that, so we can't blame the driver? It's quite a good question, actually. But
accidents do happen, period. Now, God does have plans for us, but God does not plan every second of our day. If that were true, we would be robots. So God's plans are general plans. There's the plan of salvation, the plan of marriage. He has lots of good plans for us. People screw up God's perfect plans because of our sinful behavior and our free will. But this is one of the problems that I had early on in my work in Russia back in the early 90s, because the people over there had been so brainwashed by communism, and they had had all of their lives so controlled by the government that when the government simply dissolved and they became Christians, they expected God to work in the same way. So they expected to get a fax from God every morning, well, wear this and work there, because that's what the government had done. But that's not the way it works. God gave you a brain. He expects you to use it. Yes, he wants you to be clothed, but you can pick which shirt to wear.
Text coming in, Ben from Devon. Hi guys, why are we losing our sense of justice? A sense of justice, not the actual practice of justice.
It is a searing, if I may use that word.
Conscience.
Think with me for a moment. If you were to take your hand and you had a hot iron, now if you simply put your hand against that iron, you'd be seriously burned. And so don't do that. But if you just, for the slightest of moments, were to touch your hand against a hot iron and immediately pull it back, it would kill some of the cells on the surface, but you would not be badly burned. Now later you do the same thing. What happens is you build up a callus. And so what happens then is, as people are leaving the church, they're leaving Christianity, or they're deciding not to become Christians, their conscience becomes seared to sin. And in building up that callus on the spirit and the soul of what sin really is, then people are losing their concept of righteousness. And when they lose a concept of righteousness, they lose the concept of justice.
Right. There's my mind goes to 2 Timothy chapter 3, where it lists a whole lot of the sort of characteristics that manifest themselves in these last days. And as Dr. Grady said, the searing of the conscience, as with the branding iron, the scripture says, will obviously dull our sense of justice.
And I would also invoke, I mean, I would agree with you absolutely on the scripture, but I would also invoke Romans 1, that when people become evolutionists, what happens as a consequence of believing in evolution, where there is no lawgiver, there is no law. Atheism is an attempt to say there's no lawgiver. Therefore, each one does
What is right.
make their own rules, goes back to judges. When there was no one to rule over them, each one did what was right in their own eyes or sight. That's, you make your own rules. And in Romans 1, it tells us that when people do that, when they deny the existence of the ultimate lawgiver and the ultimate law, then they make their own laws and they become lesbians, homosexuals, murderers, disobedient to parents.
My question is about sacrifices. Would I be right to say that Job was wrong to make sacrifices, offerings to God for sins? Because up to the time of Moses, there was no law in place, so there was no issue for sin for people to offer sinner sacrifices. There were no proper instructions from God as how to offer these sacrifices as well. That's not true. But anyway, I'm sure you'll jump on this.
That's not true. No.
The only sacrifices before Moses acceptable to God were the only thanksgiving ones. Noel and Abel. No, I didn't know he existed.
Well, that's a totally false concept.
They were, this is, so why is
I don't know,
God not able to accept
this.
sin offerings from perfect people like Job?
Well, first of all, I don't know who wrote this, but got so much misinformation in there, it's hard to sort it all out.
It's a mishmash a bit, isn't it, there?
Well, if we take a look at the writings of the Bible.
It's Cain and Abel, not Noel, I don't know.
Well, yes, Cain and Abel. But God did teach Adam and Eve, and of course they were taught their children about right and wrong, giving blood sacrifice as well as vegetable sacrifice. That goes right straight back to the beginning of Genesis. Noah gave the burnt offering. Abraham gave offerings to Melchizedek. Job gives the burnt offering. The fact of the matter is that when you read about these things accurately in the Bible, it says that Job and Abraham and Noah knew the ordinances or the commandments or the laws. Now, we don't know which ones they knew outside of some basic ones, which were obvious, because those laws, ordinances, rules, and so forth were not written down, but they obviously knew them, and the Bible specifically states that they did. When you read the book of Job, it says clearly that he knew the ordinances of God, at least up to his time, and he clearly knew how to do the sacrifices correctly.
Yes, very good, very good. Looking at the time left, 2 minutes. Okay, here we go. Hi to both of you. God bless you for your works to his glory. Is it written that we can judge our congregation but not non-believers? Because there is a mention there, isn't there, in the early church when they brought those that were willfully practicing sin to account before the rest of the congregation and to mark such a person?
Well, the congregation, of course, you know, if you have anything against your brother, take it to the church first. I mean, if you go that road, and that was practiced for the last 2,000 years in the church. In terms of judging others, we can judge them if we do it righteously in terms of their behavior, but what we need to do then, of course, is minister to them, attempt to show them the error of their ways and the ways of God being the correct way to behave and become Christians. That's an evangelistic thing.
But there was times where they had to set aside or even put somebody outside the congregation in the New Testament times, the early church.
Well, and again, we have the situation, for instance, when Paul comes into Jerusalem and meets the Jerusalem Council under James, and they say, you know, people have been spreading rumors that you don't observe the law. And so here's what we want you to do. We have some other brothers on the vow of a Nazarene. We want you to also take the same vow of a Nazarene. When the time comes for them to give their offering, which was their hair to be cut and burned, we want you to pay for them and you. And this way it'll prove that you are not here, you know, breaking the law. And yet they were certainly Christians at the time.
Okay, this is quite small writing, so I'm going to lean into this. Excuse me.
Oh dear.
This is from John in Glasgow. He says,
use a bigger font next time.
I asked you this question before, but I don't think I made myself clear. We haven't got a lot of time actually to do this. Oh, sorry. I'll tell you what I'm going to do, John. I'm going to forward that to Dr. Grady, and then he can answer that question, and we'll start with it on Thursday night with the answer. So thank you, Dr. Grady, and we'll see you Thursday. God bless you. Take care. Bye-bye.